Hello and welcome to our webinar today on California Assembly Bill 802. We'll be discussing details of the new energy benchmarking law and getting you tips for how to comply with the new regulations. A few housekeeping items before we start. All participant lines have been muted. If you have any questions, please submit these through the webinar platform and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. We'll also be providing a recording of the presentation after the call. So let's get started with introductions. I'm Sondra Tosky, Senior Product Manager at Measurabl. Measurabl is a SaaS platform for sustainability reporting that can help building owners identify which buildings in their platform come under disclosure regulations like AB 802 and assist with benchmarking reporting. Joining us today are Daniel Johnson at the California Energy Commission and Erik Jensen, Program Manager at CEC. We're very happy to have them here today to give us details about AB 802. And Erik, I'm going to hand off to you to get us started.
Great, thank you. So California, the 2015 version of Assembly Bill 802 included multiple revisions, not all of them in this context. So today we're just talking about the ones that are relevant to this program. Specifically, they are these two. First of all, the bill requires utilities to provide building level energy use data to building owners or their agents upon request. So we refer to that as the data access provision. And then the bill directed the California Energy Commission to create a program for benchmarking, reporting, and publicly disclosing energy use in large buildings. So the first part, the data access part, is voluntary on the part of a building owner. You can request your data if you want to. If you do request it, the utility needs to provide it. The second part, the benchmarking program, is mandatory if you own certain large buildings. But of course, the benchmarking portion relies heavily on the data access portion. You've got to have the energy use data in order to be able to benchmark. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go through a few of the definitions for the regulations. So we did a little bit of background. We completed our rulemaking fairly recently. So the regulations went into law on March 1st, and the first reporting deadline is June 1st of this year. I realize that's quite short notice. We'll talk more about that a little later. So we'll go through a few of the definitions from the regulations. First, covered building. This one actually came from the statute. We modified it slightly, but this refers to that set of buildings for which utilities are required to provide energy use data upon request. There's an unfortunate contrast between how this term is used in this program and how it's used in other programs. In many other benchmarking programs, covered buildings are those buildings for which the building owner is required to report. Again, this came to us from the statute, so we had to use it this way, and we used a different term, which we'll get to in a minute, for those buildings for which reporting is required. So that's what covered building means, and it consists of buildings that have either no residential utility accounts or 5 or more active utility accounts, at least one of which is residential. So if you have a 4-unit residential building on a residential complex, and if that building is individually metered, or if the units are individually metered, data access for that building is not guaranteed through this program, and we'll talk a little more about that situation later. Next slide, please. So disclosable buildings are those buildings for which reporting to the Energy Commission is required. We don't need to go back. Something I forgot to mention on the previous slide, we don't need to go back, I'll just mention it, is that there is no square footage threshold for data access. So utilities, if you request your data from a utility, it should not matter to them what size the building is, just for them to provide data to you. So there's no square footage threshold for data access. There is a square footage threshold here for defining this set of buildings for which reporting is required. And that's larger than 50,000 square feet, and either of the following: either no active residential utility accounts or 17 or more active residential utility accounts, regardless of the number of accounts in the building that are not residential. So if a building has anywhere from 1 to 16 residential utility accounts, It's not a disclosable building. In a minute, we're going to talk about what exactly how we're defining a utility account. That was necessary to provide clarity in the regulations because that term is not always used consistently. Please note where it says utility accounts of each energy type serving the building. So it's important to note that to reach these utility account thresholds, we're not, for example, looking at accounts of different types of utilities. So in the fourplex I mentioned earlier, if you had some number of electricity, some number of gas accounts, some number of water accounts, some number of telephone, cable TV, those would all be utility accounts. We're not counting those separately to get to the threshold. What we want to look at is number of accounts of each energy type. So we want, for example, we would want you to be above, so residential building for data access, which was on the previous slide, we want you to be 5 or more for both electricity and gas, for example. Those are the 2 energy types serving the building. Next slide, please. So utility accounts are not, when we're counting the number of utility accounts to get to a certain threshold, that's not as straightforward as it might first seem. What we're generally doing with the definition of utility account is looking at the number of utility customers in the building, or typically you can think of that as the number of tenants in the building, but we don't use the term tenant in the regulations. We think this is more faithful to the statute than just looking at the number of agreements between the building and a utility. So here's how it works. We're looking at the number of individual postal addresses for determining the number of accounts. So the graphic on the left, if you have a single building, say it has 2 retail stores in it. Let's say there's 1 meter on the building, and then those 2 tenants or businesses figure out among themselves how they're going to pay the electricity bill. Well, from the utility's perspective, they only see 1 utility account associated with that building. However, because there are multiple businesses or tenants or customers in the building, we want that to be considered 2 accounts. We feel that that counts for the threshold. And so as I said, what we're looking at is number of postal addresses in the building. So that's one case where you have 1 agreement between the utility and the building and multiple parties using that account or agreement or utility service. On the right, we have the opposite example. You could have a single business or tenant in a building, and they could have multiple utility agreements. So again, let's say it's a retail store. They might have 1 rate that they're paying for electricity inside the store. They might have a different rate that they pay for exterior lighting. And we wouldn't want things like that to count toward the threshold. We want we just want each party or each postal address to count as 1 account. So no matter how many agreements an individual party has with a utility, we're calling that 1 utility account for the purposes of this program. Next slide, please. So now we're going to take a graphical look at what we just talked about. So we're going back to data access. So this is where utilities are required to provide the data. And there are some account thresholds here. We're going to talk about disclosable buildings later, but so this is for data access, starting in the right-hand column. Buildings with no residential utility accounts. There are 2 cases. If there are 3 or more utility accounts serving the building, and again, we're looking at postal addresses or number of tenants or customers as a proxy for that. The utility is required to provide data with no customer permission required. Still in that column, the row below that, if there are fewer than 3 utility accounts serving the building, customer permission is required before utilities will provide data. And in the regulations, we specify the process for demonstrating customer permission. I don't want to go into it right now, but if there are questions about it, I can take those later. But the point here is that any number of utility accounts in a building with no residential utility accounts, or what I may refer to as commercial building to be a little, because it doesn't take as long to say, that's a covered building. The left column, at least one residential utility account. There's a similar distinction. 5 or more utility accounts, it's a covered building. The utility needs to provide data. If there are fewer than 5 utility accounts, that is outside the scope of this program for purposes of data access. The utility has discretion over whether they want to provide data in that case or not. So the cell at the bottom of the column, at least one residential utility account, those buildings are not covered. The utility may very well provide data if they want to. They likely would require customer permission in that case, but that's outside the scope of this program for the data access provision. Next slide, please. Here's a graphical representation of disclosable buildings. So the large circle is the entire set of covered buildings, those for which data access is required. Entirely within that circle are the two groups of disclosable buildings. They're all over 50,000 square feet. One of the groups has no residential utility accounts. The other group has 17 or more residential utility accounts. Next slide, please. This is the reporting and public disclosure timeline. So we've got 2 rows for the 2 distinct groups of disclosable buildings. We'll just talk about the top row first. So this is the one that has the reporting deadline this year. By June 1st, 2018, building owners are required to report to the Energy Commission building characteristic information, occupancy, information about how they're using the building, and energy use data. Information that's reported this year will not be publicly disclosed at the building level. We will use the data internally at the Energy Commission for research purposes. We may publish program-wide or region-wide data regarding the program, but we will not publicly disclose building-level data this year. Next year, when 2018 data is reported, we will be publicly disclosing building-level data. So just to be clear, there is not a year lag between what we're receiving and what we're publicly disclosing. There's just the first year where we're not doing public disclosure of building-level data, so that building owners get a chance to get practice reporting. We get a chance to practice receiving and analyzing the data, and building owners can make improvements to their buildings if they want to before public disclosure happens. And then the bottom row is those buildings with 17 or more residential utility accounts, and everything there is just 1 year later. So they'll start their first reporting obligation to the Energy Commission is next year, and then public disclosure for residential buildings will begin in 2020. Next slide, please. Here's a high-level overview of the reporting process. If there are questions about the specific steps, I can certainly take those later. Generally, you'll determine which of your buildings, you'll determine whether for any of your buildings reporting is required. I've got a slide about that later. You'll use Energy Star Portfolio Manager. It's a free online benchmarking and reporting tool provided by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. If you haven't done so already, you'll set up an account, enter your buildings. Step 3 is to get your energy use data into Portfolio Manager. There are a few options on ways you can do this. The first 2 involve going through the utility. All utilities through this program are required to, first of all, the data access provision applies to all, basically all utilities that deliver energy. So if you have a community choice aggregator that's procuring your energy, they don't necessarily have to provide data to you, but whoever has the transmission lines and has the meter on your building, that's who is responsible for providing the data to you. So having said that, all utilities that the data access provision applies to are required to provide at least a spreadsheet upon request. So if you request your energy use data, they will send you a spreadsheet in the format using the template that Portfolio Manager provides. And so it's very straightforward once you've got that spreadsheet to upload it into portfolio manager, and it will populate the appropriate cells. So all utilities are required to provide that at a minimum. Some utilities also provide an automatic upload directly into your portfolio manager account. And so that's currently, I believe that's the six largest utilities, the 4 large IOUs, LADWP and SMUD. And so for this, you'll give them, use their portal, give them some information about your portfolio manager account and for which buildings you need energy usage data, and they'll send it directly into your account. The last option is if you already have your energy bills for the building, if you've got complete information, you can enter them directly. And if you want to do that, I recommend downloading the template, the spreadsheet template from Portfolio Manager, filling it in using Excel, and then uploading the template into Portfolio Manager. I find that faster than entering your data into each cell within Portfolio Manager. Once you've done that, you'll do a final review of your data. Please make sure your square footage is right and you don't have an extra 0 or missing a 0. Check that your energy use data looks reasonable, even if the utility sent it directly into your account. Check that it looks right. They can make mistakes sometimes. We don't want, for example, they can leave a meter off when they're trying to determine the usage attributable to a building. They can leave a meter off or add a building that should be on a different, add a meter that should be on a different building. So we want to check for those things. Check your number of computers, number of employees. And those will all contribute to making sure your benchmark is accurate. Once you've done all of those things, you will submit your report from within Portfolio Manager. Let me back up a little bit. So once you go through step 4, then you'll go to the Energy Commission website, click a link, and then that'll send you back into Portfolio Manager. Because you came from that link, a report will be added to your reporting tab in Portfolio Manager. You'll use that to submit the report to us. As soon as you do that, you'll get an email confirmation from Portfolio Manager saying that they got your report and you're all done with your obligation. In future years, you will, unless you have major changes to your buildings, like for example, you add or subtract square footage from some of your buildings, future years you will usually be able to skip steps 1 and 2, and you'll just start with getting the new utility data in there. Check again, number 4, you check, make sure you've got your inputs are right, and complete your submission. So it's an annual requirement, due by June 1st each year. Next slide, please. So this is how you decide whether your building needs to be reported or not. The required column there, we talked about that already. Those are the 2 types of disclosable buildings. There are a few, excuse me a minute. Okay, there are a few exemptions. Again, buildings with 1 to 16 residential utility accounts not included. Condominiums are not included either in the data access provision or in the benchmarking program. If more than half of the floor area of a building is used for scientific experiments requiring controlled environments or manufacturing or industrial purposes, the building does not need to be reported. This does not include buildings that are casually referred to as industrial, such as warehouses. This is referring specifically to industrial processes happening within the building. This is because if there are unique processes happening in the building where it wouldn't be particularly useful to compare them to other buildings, it makes benchmarking less useful. So let's see, moving on. Buildings without a certificate of occupancy for more than half of the previous calendar year, reporting is not needed. And if the building is scheduled to be demolished 1 year or less from the reporting deadline. There's one other exemption, which is on the far right here, and that refers to when when the building is in the jurisdiction of a local benchmarking ordinance and is also a disclosable building per the state regulations. So this applies if the local jurisdiction has applied to the Energy Commission for an exemption and we have granted that exemption, and if the building owner has reported to the local jurisdiction then the building owner will not also need to apply to us. So currently there are local programs in Berkeley, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. There are also a few other jurisdictions working on programs. Those three have applied to us already to get exemptions. We have not yet granted the exemptions. We almost certainly will grant all three. We just hasn't happened yet. We're working on it. Once that has happened, if a building owner reports to the local jurisdiction, they're done with their reporting obligation to the state as well, because the local jurisdiction will send us their data. We'll include that in what we're publicly disclosing for the state. There are situations where someone is subject to the local jurisdiction, but not to the state program. For example, San Francisco, I think, goes down to 10,000 square feet. So a 15,000 square foot building in San Francisco, they would need to report to San Francisco, but not to us. The opposite situation can apply as well, though we tried to avoid it as much as possible. Certain building types might be specifically exempted in the local programs. If they're not exempted in the state program, that building would need to be reported to the state, but not to the local jurisdiction. Once we exempt local jurisdiction programs, the names of those programs will be listed on the Energy Commission website, and the significance of that will be explained. And so it'll be straightforward to go and see on the website what your obligations are. Next slide, please. Here are some resources for help understanding all of this. The Energy Commission's benchmarking webpage, energy.ca.gov/benchmarking, currently has the reporting links. There are actually fairly detailed instructions. When you click either of the reporting links and sign in a portfolio manager, there's a set of instructions there which are specific to the California program. They're not the general portfolio manager benchmarking instructions. So that's about what we've got now publicly regarding instructions. We have other documents that are just about ready to go. We have a set of frequently asked questions, a 2-page fact sheet, and some other things that we're working on as well. We'll have those all ready soon. We'll post them to the benchmarking page there. In the lower right-hand corner of the benchmarking page, if you're not already signed up, you can sign up for the benchmarking mailing list. And when you do that, you'll be notified of when we make new things available. Lastly, you can see the contact information for our benchmarking hotline. We've got both email and phone. Please use the email for now. We're working on getting our hotline ready. We hope to have them ready to go in the next few weeks, and that's when the phone number will be more important. But please use the email for now. We have a few people here who monitor the inbox, and we'll try to get back to you pretty promptly. If you do need urgent help, go ahead and call the phone number that's currently forwarding to me, and so hopefully I can get what you need. And with that, my presentation concludes, and I can take any questions.
Great, thank you, Erik. We do have a few questions. I'm going to lead off with a really applicable one. There's a month left until the reporting deadline. What should be the top priorities to meet the regulation requirements? What should people start off and make sure they do?
So utilities have, per the statute, utilities have up to 28, I think it's calendar days, to provide the data. So that's kind of the notable limiting factor. You need to give the utility time to provide the data. The large utilities in particular often provide the data. If you provide everything that needs to be in your request, they often will provide it much faster than that, as I understand it, just a couple days. So that's one of the things. In order to get the data, you've got to have your portfolio manager account needs to be ready. I guess it doesn't need to be ready if the utility is going to send you a spreadsheet, then your portfolio manager account would not need to be ready. If they're going to upload the data, though, they need to know where to send it, and specifically, you need to have your portfolio manager account ready. You need to have your buildings entered. Neither of those things takes very long. You can hire an energy consultant to help with this. Some people do, but it's not. It's fairly. I consider it to be fairly user friendly, and we're talking just to open the account and to enter your building. That's just a few minutes. And so if as soon it doesn't take you long to do that before entering the data. So I guess those are kind of the two things. And then the to actually pull the trigger, you need to, once you've done those things, you need to check the data, make sure it's accurate, both the building. So there are kind of three categories of data: building characteristic information, so the size, what you're using it for, year built. Then there's use information, so you'll see things like number of employees, number of computers, operating hours, and then the energy use data. So those are the three general categories, but you want to check all of those inputs, make sure they're right. And then the thing you have to do in order for us to see that you have reported, go to the Energy Commission website, click the reporting link, and then you'll submit the report from within your account. And so once you get that confirmation email, then you'll know that you're all done.
Great. And on the resources page at the website, do you all have a PDF file that provides a step-by-step process to submit the reporting documentation, similar to EBEWE and Energize Denver?
So the instructions that are in portfolio manager, the short answer to your question is no, not at this time. When you click the reporting link on the Energy Commission page, go into portfolio manager, you will see a pretty thorough list of instructions. They're just text instructions. So that tells you what you need to do. We do have a much more thorough document regarding how to report, prepared by our outreach contractor, some of whom are on this webinar, and that includes screenshots and is much more thorough and much more makes it more intuitive. And so we'll be posting that shortly.
Fantastic. And what's the likelihood that the compliance deadline will be delayed, or is there a way to ask for an extension? And if not, what are the penalties associated with non-compliance?
The deadline will not be delayed. It's in the regulations, and so it's law, and we can't move it. We have authority to issue fines through this program. They do not happen automatically. So some of you, for example, might be familiar with, I believe the Seattle benchmarking program lists explicitly in their ordinance, if certain things don't happen by certain dates, a certain process goes into action, and then there are certain steps that can happen, and there are specific fines that will be levied in situations. It's nothing like that here. So we don't have anything that goes into effect automatically regarding fines. We are planning to devote our resources exclusively to helping people with compliance rather than pursuing enforcement actions. Certainly this early in the program, and considering that we're giving pretty short notice of the obligation. If June 1st comes and goes and you have not yet reported, please do go ahead and report. It will not raise a red flag for us. We won't come after you for submitting the report late. We appreciate you submitting it at all, and we also don't want you to hurry too much in preparing the report. It's important that the information be accurate, and so it's more important to us that the information be here at all and be accurate than that you get us something prior to June 1st.
Great, that's really helpful. There's a question about if a building is sold. So if a building was sold like December 31st, 2017, up until this point, who's responsible for submitting the application?
The owner of the building on the reporting date is responsible for reporting to the Energy Commission. So June 1st, so this year, June 1st, 2018, whoever owns the building is responsible. So the bill or the statute ensures that regardless of who the owner was previously, the current owner has access to the energy use data, with the caveat that sometimes customer permission is required, but regardless of who the building owner was during the period for which energy use data is requested, the owner at the time of the request is guaranteed access to the data.
Great. And reminder, if anybody else has questions, you can use the Q&A portion of the webinar tool to submit those, and we'll get them answered for you. We do have a couple more. There's a question, I know, Eric, you kind of went over this, but specifically if it's a triple net building, so you don't have that, the anonymization of the data because there's only, you know, one tenant in the building or something like that. Will the landlords or tenants be required to report? Is it still the landlord responsibility?
So as far as we're concerned, the ultimate reporting obligation falls on the building owner. Now, having said that, we don't care, I don't care who we get the report from. So if it, I think we do see whose portfolio manager account or a submission comes from. So we do see who it comes from. But if we, as long as we get a report for a given building, that's fine. We don't care whether it comes from the building owner or someone else. Also, if the, you know, if it's a triple net or other situation where the owner is interested in having the tenant take on most or all of the responsibilities, and if part of their agreement is that the tenant will do things like this or similar reporting obligations or other obligations, that's fine. You're welcome to do that. Again, we see the obligation as ultimately falling on the building owner, but as long as we get it, we don't necessarily care who it comes from.
Great, that makes sense. What is, if there's a campus of buildings, they're not separately metered, do you want those reported as a single building, or should they do like an estimation for each particular building?
Okay, thank you for asking about that. So in the definition of covered buildings, we have some extra text there, which says if you have multiple buildings served by a common meter, such that you can't tell their usage apart, you need to count all that square footage together, treat that as a single building. And that applies both to data access and to whether it's a disclosable building or not. So do not please estimate usage. Just count, enter it into Portfolio Manager as, I guess you could enter it as a property, and you could enter the individual buildings. But when you request from the utility, they'll send what they've got for that 1 meter, and then you also need to consider that square footage in aggregate when determining whether it's a disclosable building. So if you've got two 30,000 square foot structures served by a single meter, you will need to report that, even though neither structure is individually over 50,000 square feet.
Great, that makes sense. One more question. Interested in knowing, what does California state plan to do with the data? Are they going to use this to do a benchmarking report, or what's, are there any anticipated uses for the data?
I'll answer that in 2 ways. So one aspect of this is the legislature's intention in directing us to do this. And they specifically mentioned the importance of this information being available in the marketplace. So for example, and I'm not quoting the, I'm kind of paraphrasing from the statute here, but the general idea is if current building owners and tenants and prospective building owners and tenants have more information about the buildings that they either currently live and work in or are considering living and working in, it helps them make more informed decisions about leasing, purchasing, making improvements. So one of the primary hopes here is that that this information becomes a bigger factor in people's real estate decisions, people deciding where they're going to live and work. We hope that in turn will provide motivation for building owners to make improvements. So that's kind of the legislative angle. From our perspective here at the Energy Commission, yes, we hope to use this data for analysis. We will be compiling program level reports. I don't know whether it'll be annually, but we certainly will have reports about both the administration of the program, things like compliance rates and how the program is running, as well as what we're learning through the program. So the energy use in buildings, maybe how different regions compare, how California compares to elsewhere in the country, and we'll look over time at how those things change.
Great. So I think that's all of the questions that we have right now. Does anybody else have, if you have any other questions, you can always, contact us directly for those. And as you saw, there's the resources available. Also, the resources available on the CEC website. So thank you, Erik, so much, and Daniel for joining us today. This has been extremely helpful. I know helped to clarify for everyone what to expect with the new regulations going into effect. So thank you for your time today.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Sondra.
Thanks all.